For the past several months, House Democrats, they've been trying to get a hold of President Trump's federal tax returns, but they've been stonewalled at every turn. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee recently filed a federal lawsuit asking the court to enforce a subpoena it issued back in May demanding to see the documents. But in New York State, Governor Cuomo, he just signed a bill that allows congressional committees to see the president's state returns. The law says tax officials, they can release them for, quote, specified and legitimate legislative purpose, and only to the Ways and Means, Senate Finance, or the Joint Committee when it comes to taxation. My next guest, he's been following this story from the very beginning, Jesse McKinley. He's the Albany bureau chief at the New York Times. Jesse, A, thanks for joining us. But B, as substantive potentially as this is, I've been really surprised by some of the reaction and the urgency from Democrats to get their hands on this. Let's first start off without treating my audience as a bunch of CPAs. So explain the distinction, obviously, between the federal and the state returns, but nonetheless, how illuminative some of these state returns could be for adjusted gross income, stuff like that.
Well, sure. Anyone who's actually filed a state return in the state of New York knows that a lot of the information that you're putting on your federal return, you just replicate on your state return. So if you talk to tax experts, a lot of the stuff that is, on your 1040 is going to be on your New York State 201. So in the case of Donald Trump, I mean, this is a guy whose home is here, whose business is here. A lot of those same numbers that would appear on the IRS forms would appear on the state returns. Now, per the law, the one that was signed yesterday by Governor Cuomo, some of that federal information would probably be redacted. But so long as it appears on the state return as unique information, i.e. money that was made in the state of New York, money that was lost in the state of New York, it would be there. So it could be potentially very illuminative.
Give an idea for some of the things on the top level line, Jesse, that could be learned from these documents. So first of all, how far back can they go in terms of looking at his state returns in New York?
Conceivably as far back as they want. I mean, the law is relatively broad in terms of the timetables. It's any state return that is requested by those three committees, the Ways and Means, Senate Finance, or Joint Committee on Taxation. So it could go as far back as they want. The question would be, you could find things like adjusted gross income, you could find business losses, you could find business earnings, you could find if you gave any money to charity. Those sorts of kind of top level line items that would also be of interest to federal investigators would also be on the state returns. Now, that being said, there are some restrictions, as I said, on some of the federal information that is exclusive to the federal return.
Now, in terms of timeline, this is effective theoretically immediately, right? I mean, unless the administration goes to court to try and stop this or whatever, theoretically, the House Ways and Means and the other committees I mentioned, they could say, hand them over here and let us go through them.
They absolutely could. Now, the question is whether they will. And thus far in our reporting out of Washington, my colleague Nick Fandos did some calls on this yesterday. There seems to be a hesitancy amongst congressional Democrats to kind of use this state law as a workaround. I think there is some sense that if they use the New York law, then it gives some tinge of partisanship to it, that they're only trying to embarrass the president, that they're trying to show him up. Whereas Richard Neal, who's the head of the House Ways and Means Committee, has been very strict that this is basically, they're trying to make sure that the auditory function that is allowed through the IRS code is being followed. So they're being very by the letter. But that being said, as this kind of standoff continues between Congress and the White House, this could eventually be the type of thing that they would use, kind of as a last-ditch effort to get their hands on that information.
Yeah, I'll be honest, Jesse, before I saw the lack of urgency from some of the Dems on the Hill, I figured this would be manna for heaven. These guys would put their arms around this, but it turned out that it sat on Cuomo's desk. Forget about even D.C. It sat on his desk for 6 weeks. Now, I know there was a lot of items, but you figured this one would get to the top of the list. He took his time. Then I'm looking to other lawmakers, including Bill Pascrell from our area. You get the sense that if they say, geez, if we dig into this thing, forget about the cause of partisanship. If we find something, we may be forced to do impeachment proceedings. Give the calculus, and I know no one's on record as saying why they're not dying to do this, But is it the fear of what they might find or the fear of how they're perceived? What's the greater driver?
I think the latter. I think your political sense there is right on. I think that for congressional Democrats, they are worried about this coming off once again as a partisan attempt to embarrass the president. And there is kind of a parallelism to the impeachment debate inside of the Democratic Party, whether pursuing impeachment or pursuing the president's tax returns is a politically palatable thing. At a certain point, the White House will say, and has said in the past, this is harassment. The president's own lawyer said that yesterday. And this idea of specified, and legitimate legislative purpose, that's a pretty broad category, but yet, the lawyers for the president and the White House will fight back and say, look, they're fishing for bad information here. There's no real reason to see this information.
What's your gut say? Now that they're available, will they be taken and will they be used?
I think once again, it goes back to that kind of ticking clock. I think that if, I don't think it's going to be used immediately. I don't even see it being used, within the next couple of months. But I think if the standoff continues in Washington, if the court battle continues, the House sued the Treasury last week to try to get these federal returns, if it becomes an issue of them just not being able to make any headway on the federal level, this would seem to be, as a last resort, a way to kind of see some of that information.
It'll be fascinating how this plays out. Jesse, I appreciate it for you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right, everybody, when we come back, in just the past 24 hours, we've seen a fire hose of bizarre stories and about this White House. But the craziest thing could be just how ordinary all this has become.